Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Paula. Thank you, Tony, and thank you to everyone who is here today to talk about predicting the impacts of off-street parking reform. A special shout out to those of you from Australia up at 4 in the morning. That's some dedication. So I'm going to, as Paula said, my name is Taylor Reich, and I'm coming from ITDP. I represent ITDP, a global NGO working on sustainable and inclusive urban passenger travel, especially in lower and middle income cities worldwide. Although I think that resources like what I'm about to talk about are relevant in the higher income world as well. I'm based in Washington, D.C., where I am today, and yeah, let's get into it. I'm going to share my screen, and and then I'll introduce you to the scope tool. So the scope of off-street parking reform, and I love this picture of repurposing off-street parking in Jakarta, Indonesia. So I'm going to start by telling you what the tool is. I'll tell you how we got inspired to build it and how we found the data to make it possible. I'll tell you how the tool works. I'll describe some other similar resources that ITDP has available, and then we'll have just a discussion. So it's the simple calculator of project effects. It really is meant as a scoping tool, a sort of sketch first order evaluation of the impacts, especially the emissions impacts of off-street parking reform. It is just one of a handful of scope tools that we have available, and I'll talk about the others later. But the idea is that this is meant as something that's relatively easy to use. You can use it even if you have never conducted a greenhouse gas calculation before or an impact calculation. It should be pretty user-friendly. We've made sure it includes default values for basically anything you might not know. And it can provide you with an estimate of the impact of an off-street parking reform. Of course, the more detail you have available, the more accurate and nuanced your result will be. It's data-driven, so we did base it on studies both from ITDP and from others of the impacts of off-street parking reform in other cities. I think that I don't need to talk about the idea of what off-street parking reform is. It seems like if you're in the parking reform network, you're probably already on board with the idea of, for example, replacing parking minimums with parking maximums or getting rid of regulation altogether. But if you'd like, I could take some time later to talk more narratively about that benefit. So how did we get started? What made this possible? Really, this was sparked by a successful policy in Mexico City in 2017. So you can see here that in this little graphic, you can see the removal of parking spaces from new buildings resulted in more space for people to live. Less space for cars, more space for people. So this policy was passed in Mexico City in 2017 with the support of ITDP's Mexico office. And the same Mexico office was then able to assess the results of that policy and see, okay, we successfully passed this policy. What happened? What did it cause? Well, first, what was the new policy? So the brown, reddish-brownish lines represent the minimum required in the previous parking regulation before 2017, and the blue lines represent the maximum permitted after the new policy. So, for example, this was not actually the requirements. This is the space that was being used for parking spaces. I'm sorry, in the average new building. And in fact, one thing we saw was that specifically for this top row, residential buildings, new buildings built after the new policy built about 35% fewer parking spaces than the maximum permitted, showing that the maximum was actually above sort of the market demand for parking. And similarly in other sectors. Um, and these numbers were the result of the ITDP study of the impact of that policy. So, with knowing now that we had this successful off-street parking reform in Mexico City that replaced parking minimums with parking maximums, and knowing that we had this in-depth study documenting the effects of it and the way that it actually resulted in less parking being constructed, that's what we needed in order to build an interactive spreadsheet tool that anyone like you can use to estimate the impacts of a new parking reform in a different city. So how does this tool work? It's a little bit complicated. It's easier when you're actually using the tool because we have so default values for pretty much everything you'd need. So you can see here the green boxes at the top are the outcomes or the impacts. The gray boxes are sort of the intermediate calculations. The blue boxes are values where we can provide a default, but if the user has a more specific value, they can override that default in order to get a more accurate, more detailed result. And that means that the sort of yellow boxes are the only ones that you actually need to fill in. And all you need to fill in is the old parking policy, whether that's a maximum, a minimum, or no policy at all. The new parking policy, whether that's a maximum, a minimum, or no policy at all. And then the size of the area, the number of housing units, or the amount of square meters of office and commercial space in the area where the policy will be changed, whether that's the entire city or just a smaller district or even a neighborhood. So you can use this at any geographical scope that you like. So I want to talk about the three of these blue boxes that I have marked with stars. I'm going to get a little bit into the details of how this works. But these three boxes are the ones you really need to understand if you want to understand how the model works. So the first one is the estimate of the unconstrained market demand for parking. This is a function of the city that you're in, even the neighborhood or district. It can vary widely. There's not a ton of research out there on this unconstrained market demand across various types of cities. And so we decided to just provide a global default of 0.5, meaning that in an unrestricted market, we estimate that developers would build about one parking space for every two residential units. And of course, that's different in different cities. In more car-oriented North American cities, that number might be higher. In denser, walkable cities, it might be lower. For example, in London, this number is known to be about 35% or 0.35 parking spaces per unit. In Mexico City, we'd estimated about 0.65 parking spaces per unit, but really it can vary quite widely. And so if you're able to estimate that for your own city, you'll get a more accurate result when you use the model. The other boxes that are really important are these average number of parking spaces built per housing unit under the old policy and under the new policy. So we use this unconstrained market demand to estimate the average number of parking spaces that will be built under the new policy, assuming that's a maximum or the removal of a policy altogether. You'd see that probably the market would build whatever the demand is. Under the old policy, you might have a case where you've got a minimum of one space per unit, but you actually see that the market is building 1.5 spaces per unit on average. Unlikely to me, but you might encounter that. And in that case, you'd want to put that into the model as a custom value in order to have a more accurate result. So really being able to estimate this market demand for parking is one of the very key factors for the whole model. And you can use our default, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. It'll get you a very rough estimate, but if you want to have a more detailed estimate, this is probably the place to put your effort into populating a more detailed value. Um, sorry, you also see sort of toward the lower left of this slide the percentage of households that will own cars in buildings with at least one or parking space per unit, and the percentage of households that will own cars even in buildings with no off-street parking. So, clearly some people will own cars still, even if they have no parking in the building. I personally live in a building that has no off-street parking at all, and I don't own a car, but many of my neighbors in the building do. And of course, the opposite is also true. Some percentage of people will not own cars, even if they do have a parking space available. So, how do we estimate that? How do we provide defaults for that? The defaults we have come from San Francisco, from a study by Professor Millard Ball at the University of Southern California, and or is UCLA? He's in Los Angeles in any case, um, and it this study shows that, you know, as there are fewer parking spaces per unit, the car ownership rate in a building will decrease, as we'd expect. But, the particular relationship might be different in your city than in San Francisco. So we use the default from San Francisco, but this is another place where you might want to override it with city-specific data from your own city if you have available. So that's all the detail about the really workings of the tool, which, as you saw in this first slide, is sort of a spreadsheet model that you download the Excel tool and you can scroll through it. I can't see the chat, but if I believe Paula has already put the link in the chat there. And so we can get more into the technical details. If you have any other questions about this flowchart or about how the tool works, I'm happy to answer that. But for now, I did want to make sure to share some other resources, similar resources that ITDP has made available. First, of course, this scope tool is a quantitative tool to estimate impacts, and that can be a useful tool in advocacy or planning for parking reform. But of course, you also need a narrative and sort of policy understanding of exactly how to do this. So that's why ITDP provides these 3 reports that give a bigger picture understanding of how parking reform can be implemented, success stories from around the globe, and perhaps lessons learned, both for off-street parking reform as well as on-street and other tools to reduce traffic. And we also have other scope tools, other sketch level impact tools for both bus rapid transport, bus rapid transit, and protected bicycle lane networks. And I think Paula can also share the links to those in the chat as well. So that's all I have to share in terms of an introduction to the off-street parking scope tool, but I'm happy to stick around and discuss. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back to the conversation, but I'm happy to bring any of these slides back up if we'd like to discuss some more. And Paula, thank you for following along with the links.
Thank you, Taylor. So how we'll do Q&A and discussion. I have some questions and some stuff to prime the pump here. If folks have questions themselves, you could put them in the chat or raise your hand, and we can just let you unmute. One question I have is this tool most appropriate, or what's the level of I could see it being used to predict the impact of a proposed reform, like trying to say, okay, if we get rid of parking mandates, here's what we might achieve as far as GHG reductions, and also for you're evaluating or estimating the impacts of a reform that's happened in the past. Where do you think, like, are those both appropriate use cases to like try and figure out what's happened in places where you have a little bit more complete data? Can you speak a little bit just to like, what the most appropriate use cases for folks might be for this tool?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really meant for a policy that's being proposed or discussed. However, you could also use it for a policy that has already been implemented, and in that case, you could actually have a much more detailed estimate of some of these variables going in, you could actually go ahead and try and collect data on the number of parking spaces that are actually being built after the parking reform.
Mm-hmm. Matt Frommer in Colorado says, thank you for the presentation. And what are the outputs on the model? Is it reduction in GHG per capita for residents, or what is it telling them?
Yes, so it has three outputs. It's the total reduction in greenhouse gases for the resulting from the policy across the geographical area. It's the total reduction in local air pollutants, especially particulate matter, PM 2.5, and I believe carbon monoxide and nitrogen oxides. And the third is sort of the reduced built up space being taken up by parking spaces, and an estimate of the additional number of residential units that can be built instead of the need for parking garage space.
Mhm.
Um,
Now, oh, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, you and I had a discussion before the presentation, um, and we talked about the applicability of this in local activism, right? Like with that, in a lot of times on the local level, the straight GHG numbers aren't necessarily what's moving the city council, right? As far as other impacts of negative externalities of parking. And you mentioned a couple like the particulate matter and other environmental cases, but we also talked about that you calculate a few interim data points that could be used by activists to help convey the potential benefits of parking reform for other areas of livability and concern. Do you want to share some thoughts on that?
That's exactly right. So in that case, we focus on the greenhouse gas benefits. That's the largest part of ITDP's mission, as well as the benefit in terms of the number of new housing units that can be built using in the same geographical area. But we also, sort of in the intermediate calculations, we have an estimate of the total reduction in vehicle kilometers traveled, which you can convert to vehicle miles. And so we don't pull this out as a key result in the model. I mean, maybe we could do so in a subsequent version, but if you're willing to take an extra couple of minutes and dig into the model, you can pull that out and then use that to estimate the impacts for road safety, perhaps, or congestion, or even the cost to residents of vehicle maintenance and fuel, those kinds of things.
Fantastic. Once again, folks, if you do have a question you want to ask live, raise your hand or post in the Slack. Otherwise, I still have more to go. Um, Michael Wade in Dallas asks, is the tool available for free or purchase? If not, when it might be available? I think that's a easy one to answer.
Yeah, it is 100% free and open for your use. I just put the link back in the chat. Please go ahead. In
You have
fact,
to you have to give ITDP an email address, right? I think you guys require the yeah.
yeah. So if you don't have an email address, you might have a little bit of difficulty.
You can use mine if you need it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
yeah.
so uh, one question I had was, do you know of any studies? So it seems like this could be interesting to like for someone to take this or a group to take this and do some collection of the information for a bunch of cities or cities in a metro area and run them through. Is this appropriate for that? And do you know of any researchers who might be taking this already and kind of trying to find these numbers for some region or type of cities to just generalize a potential impact from regional reforms, for example?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely an appropriate use case for this. It, I think, could be done quite easily with some basic default data for the different parts of the region. I don't know of anyone who's doing that exact effort though.
Hmm.
Um, so one thing I was thinking, I think that my slides went a little bit more quickly than I was expecting, and if there aren't a lot more questions, I could even pull up the model itself and take 10 minutes and try to run through it quickly and explain step by step, demonstrate how to use it.
I think that'd be fantastic, and then that might generate some other questions from us. So yeah, let's do that. I'll mute myself and spotlight
Any
you
other
again.
questions from anyone here before I dive back in there? Great. All right. Well, let's do this interactively. So I'm going to share my screen again. Actually, I'm going to do it this way. And I'm going to zoom in a little bit. Can you read the contents of these cells? Is it large enough? Well, if you're not
I
saying no,
can.
I'll do this. Sorry?
I said I can.
Okay, great. Um, so I want someone to think of to pick a city that we should do. I'm going to say we're going to implement a policy next year. Um, which city do we want to take a look at? And which country is it in?
Minneapolis.
Minneapolis. Sounds good. And that is in the USA. Um, do you have an estimate of how quickly Minneapolis is growing every year? How many new people are moving in or being born?
About 7,000.
Okay. That sounds like what, about maybe 2% of the city's population, 1%?
Um, Boy, let's see,
That's
we're the metropolitan area is about almost 2.5 million right now. So, and I just think of the city itself. Minneapolis has about 500,000 people in it, the city proper.
right. So 1.5% population growth rate. And let's just assume that I think we'll actually limit ourselves to residential for this quick
Hmm.
demonstration. But the formulas for office and commercial work similarly. I'm going to use the default emission factors and assume 252 working days a year. Um, so as I was saying earlier, this is really the keystone of the model, this estimate of the market demand for residential parking. Do you have a reason to believe that zero point 0.5 parking spaces per unit is higher or lower than the market demand for off-street parking in Minneapolis at the present?
I would say it's lower.
Okay. What would you suggest, just as a back of the envelope estimate?
For off-street parking in residential areas, there's generally 2 spots per house, I would say.
And you think that's a function not of regulation, but if there were no regulation at all, that's still how much the market new developers would deliver?
Correct, just because of the size of the lots.
Okay. Well, that shouldn't be 2%. That should just be 2. Oh, this is kind of funny that it's showing up as a percentage, but I'll fix that and re-upload it. But in the meantime, 200% is 2. So you can see here we're using that value of 2. So I'm going to say no policy change to office or commercial buildings, only to residential. So what's the current policy? It's got to be at least 2 spaces required per unit, right?
Yeah, in residential single family homesteads, it would be basically 2. If it's a apartment building, it's 1.
Okay, shall we pick one of those to focus our analysis on either single family or apartments?
Let's do the apartment one then, I guess.
Okay. Do you still think that 2 spaces per unit in the apartment is the correct sort of market demand?
Uh, the market demand.
Yeah.
Uh, well, everybody says they're
Well,
short. Everybody says they're short on parking, so the demand would be 2. The reality is, it's probably they don't have that many, and that's a frustration for a lot of folks. We are in the process of changing everything too, so we're taking away parking spaces on street. So we're kind of doing like Seattle. It's rather fascinating to watch it go. That's why I'm
hmm.
here, just to learn more about all this. So
Okay. Well,
It could be a tricky one here,
yeah.
because Minneapolis also currently doesn't have any parking mandates. They have not had any for since the 2040 plan.
right,
Um,
exactly.
yeah, yeah.
And
I'm
we're putting
curious.
in bike lanes everywhere, and all kinds of stuff. We're trying to be very proactive, but it's confusing for a lot of the people.
Yeah, I'm curious. Yeah, I don't want to take away from Minneapolis, but if Michael, who shared the question, if Michael Wade's in here from City of Dallas, and they're looking at implementing a policy next year, Michael, do you have some of this data? You're a city staff. Do you know some of this stuff for Dallas?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Um, it would be long shots for some of this. Of course, when you're estimating per unit, I know our Minneapolis example came kind of per single family home, but I think Minneapolis's per apartment parking provision has dropped pretty low over the last kind of 10 or 11 years that they've been toying, kind of incrementally decreasing. So when it comes to Dallas, the closest that I have right now is more that we're getting estimates that we overbuild by about 20 to 30% because of regulations. So, you know, if we right now we're just talking about housing, we require one space per bedroom. If you just really flatten out the market and call every new apartment a 2-bedroom unit, then that's 2 spaces per unit. If we expect that with no minimums, that drops by 20 to 30%, then what's that, about 1.3 or 1.4, something like that. So that's kind of what I have on hand right now. As soon as we, are off this call and are able to toy around with this and get just a little bit more information, then we'll be able to dial it in a little bit better. But that's kind of what I have on hand right now.
Great. Yeah, let's switch to Dallas as the example
Yep.
then, and say, that if there were no that the average unit is 2 bedrooms. If there were no regulation at all, the average developer would probably build about 1.4 parking spaces for an average 2-bedroom unit.
Sure.
And then, but we're currently requiring two spaces per unit.
Yeah.
And the new policy, are you
No
considering
maximums.
maximum or just taking out the regulation entirely?
Just taking it out right now. Yeah.
Great. And then
in this context of Sunbelt community, introducing maximums is a big fear factor. So
sure,
we don't want to get into that.
that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I think population growth is, I don't know, probably similar. It's a bigger city, but we're growing less. So that actually, gosh, I wish I had population growth on hand, but if we took that same 7,000 per year estimate and divided it by 1.3 million folks in city, it's about is that a 0.5% actually? So
yeah.
On that's in the first table, Taylor.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. 1.5% sounds about right.
let's call it less. Let's call it 1, maybe split the difference.
Okay, sounds good. And then here's this question is, can we estimate how many housing units are currently in the area where the change will apply?
Man, this is a reasonable question that I don't have an answer to on hand.
That could be the order of magnitude. I mean, we're not.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about 1.3 million residents, should we just call it 70% of that? Should we just call it a million or 900,000 units?
Sure.
Man, I'm probably embarrassing myself in front of everybody.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
Numbers.
I'm the one who's embarrassed by this being a little percentage instead of a flat number. I'm gonna have to fix that right away.
That's okay. This is at least showing itself to be a tool that once the raw data is fed into it well, I'm sure we'll be able to produce some extremely useful stuff. So looking forward to it.
And so now what we're estimating is, so now we're getting into the estimates of parking construction. First, under the old policy, we're estimating how many spaces will actually be built. And so this is, we're saying, okay, the minimum is 2, but often developers will, on average, build slightly more than the minimum, often sort of for reasons like filling out floor plates in multifamily buildings. And so we're going to estimate 2.2 spaces per unit. And the new policy we're saying, all right, they're going to build whatever we've estimated to be the market demand, which we said is probably about 1.4 spaces per unit. And then here's, you remember I was talking about that example of San Francisco and the variation in car ownership, in buildings with no parking, a third of people will still own cars, and in buildings where everyone has a parking space, 80% of people will own cars. Just in order to save time, I'm going to say let's leave those San Francisco defaults in for now, but you might want to tweak those up a little bit in both cases to reflect Dallas conditions. Here we have the average number of trips per day, almost 2 trips per day for the average car space. That might be higher in a place like Dallas. This I think is taken from Mexico City. And the average trip length might also be longer in Dallas. But again, just for the sake of a demonstration, let's leave these as it is. Finally, we've got this estimate that the average housing unit is about 100 square meters or close to 1,000 square feet. And then we have the estimate of 30 square meters or close to 300 square feet per parking space. Do either of those seem horribly off to you, or shall we just leave the defaults for now?
I'm so sorry. Would you translate that to square feet again? I think you just
about 1,000 square feet for the average housing unit, and about 250, 300 square feet for the average parking space.
I would bump up the housing unit just 20% or so, 30%. Yeah.
Great. All right. So now we can go to the results tab to see the overall. The first thing we see is that immediately upon passing the policy, there's no effect on greenhouse gas emissions because no new buildings have been built. But then every 5 years, we're basically adding 30,000 tons per year reduction in greenhouse gases, such that the cumulative effect is that over the next 20 years, we would abate almost 1.5 million tons of greenhouse gases in total. I like to use the EPA equivalency calculator. I'm going to reshare my screen so that you can see me doing that. So you can use the EPA greenhouse gas equivalency calculator, and let's put in 1,400,000 metric tons of CO2, and that's the equivalent of 8,000 rail cars of coal. It's the equivalent of operating 4 natural gas power plants for a year. Just like a large amount of emission reduction. It's the equivalent of.
Well, Taylor, this is good. This is very visual too. I appreciate pairing it with this EPA website because it does give people who might see greenhouse gas emissions as pretty ambiguous still. Something very visual, and making it numerical. Our leaders do at least like, once we've set a goal, to see how our numbers are compared to it. I know Tony had mentioned earlier that there could be some other metrics in between, like vehicle miles traveled, that kind of thing. If this puts those out, then that would be great to see too.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
was gonna be my next question. Yeah.
Yeah, let's get to that. So that's the impact on greenhouse gas emissions. We also have numbers of tons of local air pollutants that are prevented, and actually currently working on how to hook that up into estimating health outcomes. And we have this estimate that by 2045, 20 years, this policy could result in more than 30,000 new housing units across the area that we've analyzed. So if you wanted to get into the sort of details here of the vehicle miles traveled, we didn't build the model to make that surface that immediately. If you guys think that would be valuable, that's something I could incorporate into the next update and release of the model, which is something we're planning to maintain and make incremental improvements to. But you can open up these sort of in-depth calculations and, go nuts looking around at how all this stuff works. But down here, we can see overall vehicle kilometers traveled, avoided. We can see that even the very first year, we are removing about 22 million vehicle kilometers, which I guess would be something like 15 million vehicle miles. And of course, we're adding that every year so that we get these really high numbers later on in the analysis. So you could take this and then pull this number out and do your own analysis to estimate the effects that might have on congestion or time savings or road safety. In fact, I'd love to hear either by voice or in the chat what other benefits you think would be most important to include if we're going to expand this model in the future. Do you want to see things like effect on congestion, effect on road safety, the health effects of the air pollution reduction? What kind of numbers will be most helpful in convincing your local decision makers?
One thing real quick, Taylor, is we had a question and a conversation here around trying to estimate the demand, right? And like whether you're trying to use the actual, like if parking were not mandated and it were priced somehow or unbundled, we would assume that the demand would actually be lower than what developers might be providing today based on lender models and their business models. So one question is, first, like, what is the number appropriate to use? And I guess one thing I would be interested to see here is how some estimate of how these things compound, right? Like obviously the first 5 years, the second 5 years, you would expect that you might have additional benefits because the policy we know kind of has positive feedback loops. So those kind of tie together. How should you estimate the demand since this is a multi-decade projection?
Yeah, that's a good point. The sort of second order effect that as you're building a less car-centric city, the demand for parking spaces will go down even farther. In order to include something like that in this tool, I would have liked to have had to be able to find a strong source of data to provide a default, which I wasn't able to find. And so for this publication, we decided to go a little bit more conservative and just say, okay, we assume that the number is going to be flat over the period. There are certainly ways you could take this model and run it more than once in order to make those estimates. You could say, okay, I'm going to run this model once to estimate the next 10 years. And then after that, I'll run it again, but change the estimate of the market demand. And in fact, I'd be interested in talking more about how we could come up with a way of estimating that second order effect and building it into the tool. But short answer is it's not in there right now.
There's someone, Joel, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Joel Mandela here from the Metropolitan Planning Organization in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I really appreciate the presentation, and the tool looks great. And I also understand that it's based on Mexico City. I think my quick question is just, is there any plans to kind of develop a centric, system with the miles and all that, and then also maybe even have some typologies that kind of give some default values for different regions, maybe across the US? I think that could be super valuable.
So ITDP our focus is mostly in lower and middle income countries. That's sort of the theory is that we want to do our best to help these countries avoid making the mistakes of the US before all the highways are built and everything is baked in. And so I don't think that ITDP is going to make that investment ourselves in sort of localizing this to the US context. However, if you know of an organization that would be interested in doing so, we would love to collaborate and work together to make that happen. I can certainly take the time to support that localization, but. I, can't promise we're going to do it ourselves.
there's a lot of really good suggestions, which I think you're noting, right, for what ideas of things you might add to the tool. On the topic, we're close to time, but I had a question in my chat here that was around, and it kind of ties into what you just said, like around, this is an international tool, and a lot of ITDP's work is international, and this is a little bit broader, but how can US based advocates learn more from international data? How can we obviously when US cities ask about stuff, they discount, oh, that's a lot of times it's because it's European in focus. So that's European, we aren't there. But when you're looking at cities like, I think it was Kigali that, has pricing that changes, depending on where you are in the city, or other cities, like how can we, do you have any tips for people on how to best present international data to domestic audiences?
I mean, I think that one point is that the variation between cities, even in the U.S., is so great that there's no particular reason why we should learn from, well, a city in Texas should consider it appropriate to learn from a city in California or New England, but not from a city in Mexico. And whereas in a lot of cases, the city in Texas might actually be more similar to somewhere like Monterey in terms of, certainly climate, but also certain aspects of the built environment or the culture. And I also think that what's really inspiring is being able to see what international cities have been able to do, oftentimes at much lower public expense. For example, the Transit Costs Project out of NYU mostly has been showing that the US is sort of routinely the most expensive country to build mass rapid transport, especially rail, and finding all these reasons for why that is, and really showing how we can learn not just from cities in Europe, but also cities in Latin America. Places like Turkey have been able to manage large transit projects very cost effectively. And there's no reason the US can't do the same, but we're not going to be able to figure it out unless we can learn from other places.